The gun oil and leather scent of the saddle shop had become Elias Carr's entire world, not by accident, by design. He had built it that way, piece by piece, in the 3 years since they lowered Rose into the frozen ground of Fort Laramie Cemetery on a Tuesday morning so cold that the preacher's words crystallized in the air before anyone could hear them properly. 3 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. 3 years of keeping his hands so busy that his mind had no choice but to follow. 3 years of turning grief into craft until the two things had become so intertwined that Elias could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He was 28 years old. The lines around his eyes belonged to a man twice that age. The December night pressed against the single window of the shop like something alive, the temperature having dropped so far below zero that the mud in the street had turned to iron, and the horses at the livery stood motionless in their stalls, conserving whatever warmth their bodies could still manufacture. Inside, the small iron stove in the corner threw orange light across the workbench where Elias sat, his calloused hands moving through the familiar ritual of stitching a saddle skirt with a precision that required no conscious thought at all. That was the point. The moment his hands stopped moving, the quiet came in. And the quiet in that shop, in that town, in that life, was the loudest thing Elias Carr had ever heard. On the shelf above the workbench, 2 items sat in the exact positions they had occupied for 3 years. A framed photograph, small and slightly blurred the way photographs from that era tended to be, showing a young woman with dark hair and a smile that had always made Elias feel like the sun had come out from behind a cloud. Beside it, tucked into the corner of the frame, a single dried flower, brown and fragile now, that had been placed there by hands that no longer existed in this world. Rose, and the baby, who had never had the chance to be named. Elias did not look at the photograph. He had not looked at it directly in months, but he knew precisely where it was at every moment, the way a man knows where his heart is even when he cannot see it. And the knowledge of it sat in his chest like a stone that had been there so long he had stopped feeling its weight even though it never once left him. Somewhere across town, in the small apartment above the barber shop he owned on the main street, his younger brother Noah was probably still awake. Noah was 25 and constitutionally incapable of giving up on things he loved, which was both his greatest quality and his most exhausting one. He had tried to coax Elias back to life more times than either of them could count. Sunday dinners that Elias declined with a shake of his head, dances at the Grange Hall that Elias pretended not to hear about, conversations across the workbench that Elias redirected toward leather grades and saddle tree measurements until Noah eventually ran out of patience and went home. The town had its own understanding of Elias Carr by now. He was the man who had stopped smiling the day he buried his wife, not unfriendly, not unkind. He was fair in his dealings and steady in his work, and if you needed a saddle repaired, he would do it right and charge you honestly and hand it back to you without complaint. But the warmth that Fort Laramie remembered from before, the easy laugh, the way he used to tip his hat to women in the street and stop to talk with old men on their porches, that had gone into the ground with Rose, and nobody expected it to come back up again. Elias had been awake for 19 hours when he finally set down his tools just past midnight and allowed himself to look up from the workbench. The shop was silent except for the tick of the stove and the low moan of wind finding the gaps in the old wooden walls. His breath made small clouds in the air even indoors. The fire was burning low and he should have put more wood on an hour ago, but he had not noticed. And that was its own kind of information, the way a man could sit inside a cold room for so long that cold became normal. He picked up his coffee cup. It had been empty for 2 hours. He set it back down. Outside, through the frosted glass of the single window, Fort Laramie lay still and frozen under a sky so black and so full of stars that it looked like something impossible, like a painting of a sky rather than a real one. The kind of sky Rose had loved. She used to drag him outside on clear nights just to stand in it, both of them tipping their heads back and saying nothing because some things did not need words, and she had always understood which things those were. Elias stood up from the workbench. He put on his heavy coat, turned down the lamp, banked the stove, and walked home through the cold without looking up at the stars. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning. It did not arrive by telegraph, which would have been faster, but by the hand of Clem Hadley, Fort Laramie's sheriff, who had held that position for 11 years, and who possessed a face that had been weathered by those years into something resembling good leather, durable and honest, and deeply lined. Clem was not a man given to dramatic entrances, but the expression he wore when he pushed open the door of the saddle shop at 7:30 in the morning was one that Elias had never seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who did not know how to begin what he needed to say. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending. Clem. Elias. The sheriff stepped inside and shut the door behind him, his breath coming in white clouds, his boots leaving small rectangles of packed snow on the wooden floor. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand with the careful grip of someone carrying something they were not sure they should be carrying. "We have got a situation." Elias set down the harness. In his experience, situations that required the sheriff to use that particular tone before 8 in the morning were rarely the kind that resolved themselves quickly. What kind of situation? Clem cleared his throat. The morning stage came in about 30 minutes ago. There was a passenger on it. He paused. A young woman. She came from Boston. Another pause, longer this time. She says she is here to be married. The words sat in the cold air of the shop like a foreign object. Elias stared at him. She had a letter, Clem continued, and he held out the folded paper with the air of a man offering something he would very much prefer to keep. With your name on it, your address, your description. He watched Elias take the paper, watched him unfold it, watched the blood leave his face as he read the first 3 lines. I take it you did not send away for a mail-order bride. No, Elias said. His voice came out very flat. I did not. The letter was in his brother's handwriting. He would have recognized it anywhere. He had grown up watching those letters form on schoolroom slates and in the margins of church bulletins and on the backs of receipts when Noah was too excited about something to wait for proper paper. The handwriting of a man who thought faster than he could write and wrote faster than most people thought. 4 months. The letter was dated in August, which meant Noah had been writing to this woman for 4 months. Describing Elias's life, Elias's work, Elias's house, the house Elias had built with his own hands during the first year of his marriage, with every board and nail placed in anticipation of the family he and Rose would fill it with. The letter described a man who had known great sadness, but who was ready now to begin again, ready to offer a good home and honest partnership to the right woman. The right woman was apparently standing outside in the December cold right now. She cannot stay out there, Clem said. Temperature is 16 below, and she is not dressed for it. Elias folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and walked out of the shop. The main street of Fort Laramie on a December morning at 7:30 looked like the surface of the moon rendered in shades of brown and gray and white. The few people who had business outside moved quickly, heads down, breath streaming. The stagecoach sat in front of the general store with its horses stamping and blowing great clouds of vapor into the frozen air, and the driver was already unhitching them with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted to get indoors as fast as humanly possible. And there she was. Elias stopped walking. He had been expecting, without quite articulating it to himself, someone who looked like she belonged here. Someone sturdy and practical. Someone who had made the journey from Boston to Wyoming territory with the right equipment and the right expectations. What he had not been expecting was the most obviously mismatched person he had ever seen standing in the middle of Fort Laramie in his life. She was young, somewhere around 23 or 24, with dark hair that had mostly escaped whatever arrangement it had started the morning in and was now doing as it pleased in the wind. She wore a traveling dress in a shade of blue that might have been fashionable in Boston 3 seasons ago, topped with a coat that was entirely appropriate for a mild New England autumn and entirely catastrophic for a Wyoming December. She was shivering so violently that the motion was visible from 30 feet away. Her lips had gone a shade of blue that matched her dress in a way she certainly had not intended. At her feet sat 3 large trunks. On top of one of the trunks sat a covered bird cage, from which came an irregular series of muttered sounds that Elias could not quite make out from this distance. She had not yet seen him. She was looking in the wrong direction, turned toward the general store with the concentrated expression of someone trying to determine the best course of action and finding all available courses equally poor. Her hat was tilted at an angle that suggested it had not been tilted that way when she put it on, but had arrived at its current position through a series of small disasters during the journey. Then she turned. She saw Clem first, and then followed the direction of Clem's gaze and found Elias. And when their eyes met, something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. The look of a person who had traveled a very long way, based on a story they had believed completely, and who was now, in the first moment of arrival, beginning to understand that the story might not have been entirely accurate. She squared her shoulders. She began to walk toward him. What happened next would be described by various witnesses over the following months with a degree of loving detail that suggested the people of Fort Laramie had been starved for entertainment and were not inclined to let a good story go to waste. Her front foot found the edge of the water trough that sat along the boardwalk, a long wooden basin that had frozen solid during the night into a surface roughly equivalent to greased glass. The foot slipped. The momentum of a young woman who had been walking with some determination transferred itself in the wrong direction entirely. She went forward and then sideways, and then, with what seemed to Elias like a terrible and unhurried inevitability, she went down. She hit the frozen surface of the trough with a sound like a dropped book. Her hat came off. Her dark hair released itself from its remaining pins and cascaded across the ice in a direction that seemed to surprise even her. The bird cage tipped off the trunk it had been resting on and landed on its side, and the cloth covering it slid away. And from within the cage came an eruption of language that made 2 men on the far side of the street turn around and a horse at the hitching post flatten its ears. One of the trunks chose this moment to spring its latch. An assortment of feminine clothing distributed itself across the frozen ground with the democratic generosity of things that have been confined too long. The young woman lay flat on her back on the frozen water trough, her skirts hiked up to reveal sensible boots and what appeared to be an impressive number of petticoats, staring up at the December sky with the expression of someone taking a moment to fully process recent events before deciding how to respond to them. Elias Carr looked at her. He had not intended to laugh. The laugh arrived without his permission, moving up through his chest and his throat and out into the December air before he had any opportunity to stop it or redirect it or convert it into something more appropriate. It was not a small or polite sound. It was a full and genuine and completely involuntary laugh, the kind that shakes a person's shoulders and brings water to their eyes, the kind that cannot be faked or performed because it comes from somewhere too deep and too honest to be manufactured. He had not made that sound in 3 years. The two men across the street were staring at him now instead of the woman. An elderly woman who had been making her careful way along the boardwalk had stopped completely, one hand pressed to her sternum, her expression suggesting she had just witnessed something that required a moment of silent acknowledgement. Clem Hadley, standing at Elias's shoulder, was looking at him with an expression he had never worn in 11 years of wearing the sheriff's badge. The woman on the frozen trough turned her head and looked at Elias. Her cheeks, already pink from the cold, went a shade darker. She had green eyes, he noticed. The unusual green of new grass in the first week of spring, and they were looking at him right now with an expression that walked the precise line between mortification and the decision to find the whole thing as funny as he apparently did. "This," she said, with as much dignity as the situation could be said to allow, "is not how I imagined our first meeting." The laugh faded. The situation reasserted itself. Elias stepped forward and offered his hand. She took it without hesitation, her frozen fingers closing around his palm, and he pulled her to her feet with the ease of someone accustomed to physical work. She was shorter than he had realized, the top of her head coming to somewhere around his shoulder, and she had to tilt her face up to look at him, which she did directly and without flinching, despite everything that had just happened. "Miss," he said, "there has been a mistake." Something moved behind her eyes. She had, he understood, been prepared for some version of this possibility. She had prepared for it and set it aside during 3 weeks of travel and arrived here having chosen to believe in something. And now that something was coming apart in her hands in the first 90 seconds, and she was watching it happen with the careful stillness of someone who has learned, through hard experience, not to let what they feel show on their face until they know they are somewhere safe enough to feel it. "What kind of mistake?" she said. Her voice was steadier than her face. "I did not send for a mail-order bride." He said it as gently as he could manage. "I believe my younger brother may have done this without my knowledge. I am sorry you came all this way, miss. I will cover the cost of your return to Boston." The steadiness held for exactly 2 more seconds. Then something cracked behind those green eyes, a small and private fracture that she controlled immediately and completely, pressing it back behind whatever wall she kept such things behind. Only the slight brightness that appeared at the edges of her eyes gave it away, and only because Elias had been watching closely enough to notice. She released his hand and wrapped both arms around herself against the cold. "I see," she said. "Of course. I should have known." A pause, barely a breath. "The letters were so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe someone actually wanted me here." Something shifted in Elias's chest at those words. He did not examine what it was. "You can stay somewhere in town until the stage runs again," he said. "The cold should break in a day or 2. I will speak with Clem about accommodation." She nodded, bending to gather her scattered belongings from the ice with the careful efficiency of someone who has been cleaning up their own messes for long enough that embarrassment has been worn smooth by repetition. "I cannot return to Boston," she said, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact, against the sound of the wind, and the protesting commentary of the bird in the cage. There is nothing to return to. Elias looked at Clem. Clem looked at the woman, then back at Elias, then at the boardwalk, then at some middle distance, where he apparently found nothing useful, and finally raised both hands in the small gesture of a man who has decided that this particular problem is not within his jurisdiction. Elias looked back at the woman kneeling on the ice in her inadequate coat, repacking her trunk with her hands shaking from cold, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, the green-eyed parrot in the cage beside her, watching the proceedings with an expression of severe judgment. "What is your name?" he said. She looked up. Clara Wynn." He picked up 2 of the trunks. "My house is at the end of the street," he said. "The spare room has a lock on the door. You will stay there until we determine what is to be done. Can you manage the bird?" Clara Wynn stood up from the ice. "Yes," she said. She picked up the cage. Duchess immediately offered her assessment of the morning's events in language that would have caused genuine offense in any parlor in Boston. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "She belonged to my mother. I am working on her vocabulary." "I see," Elias said. He turned and began walking toward the end of the street, the trunks balanced in each hand. After a moment, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, slightly uneven on the icy ground, accompanied by the sound of an offended parrot working through her considerable repertoire. He did not look back, but something in his chest, in the place where the stone had lived for 3 long years, had shifted very slightly. The way something shifts when a door opens that has been closed for too long, letting in a thin line of light and cold air and the distant possibility of something he had entirely stopped believing in. He did not have a name for it yet. He walked on through the December cold, carrying the woman's trunks toward the house he had built for someone else, and behind him, Clara Wynn picked her careful way across the ice, and Fort Laramie watched them go with the quiet and comprehensive attention of a small town that has just witnessed something worth remembering. The spare room had a window that faced east. Elias had built it that way deliberately, back when he was building the house with Rose's preferences in his hands like a blueprint, because she had told him once that she wanted to wake up to light rather than darkness, that there was something about morning coming through a window that made the day feel like a gift rather than an obligation. He had framed that window himself, set the glass himself, planed the sill smooth with his own tools, and for the brief time they had lived in the house together, Rose had stood at it every morning with her coffee cup and her quiet happiness, and it had been one of the small and perfect things about their life that he had never thought to catalog because he had assumed, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never lost anything important, that it would always be there. Now Clara Wynn stood at that window. Elias did not see her do it. He was already in his workshop before first light, already 3 hours into a saddle commission that required his full attention and was therefore ideal for his purposes. But when he came in at mid-morning for coffee, he saw the evidence of it. The window in the spare room faced the kitchen where he stood, and through the glass, he could see the marks of someone's breath on the cold pane. A small fog of condensation at exactly the height where a person of Clara's stature would stand if they were leaning close to look at something outside. He poured his coffee and did not think about it further, or he tried not to. The first 3 days established their routines with the grim inevitability of 2 people who have been placed in close proximity and have decided, through some unspoken mutual agreement, to make the best of it without making too much of it. Clara rose before Elias every morning, which surprised him, He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that a woman from Boston would sleep late and move slowly through mornings the way people who had been cushioned from necessity tended to do. Instead, he came downstairs the first morning to find the kitchen already warm, the stove fed and burning evenly, and a pot of something on the heat that turned out to be oatmeal, made properly, with salt and not sweetened into mush the way some people made it as if they were feeding children who needed bribing. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Clara was at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something in small, neat columns. She had heard him on the stairs and looked up, and there was a brief negotiation in her expression between several possible responses before she settled on the most practical one. "I made breakfast," she said. "I hope that is acceptable." "It is," he said. He sat down. She brought him a bowl and a cup of coffee, and then returned to her paper and her columns without further comment. And they ate in a silence that was awkward. The way new shoes are awkward, not painful exactly, but requiring a continuous low-level adjustment that was exhausting in its own quiet way. Duchess, in her cage near the window, observed them both with the unsettling attentiveness of something that understood more than it should. "Damnation," the parrot said thoughtfully into the silence. Clara closed her eyes for one brief moment. "I apologize." Elias picked up his coffee. "Does she say anything else?" "She knows approximately 40 words," Clara said. "About 12 of them are suitable for polite company. And the rest are the legacy of 6 months aboard a merchant vessel with a crew whose vocabulary was extensive in very specific directions." Clara looked at Duchess with the expression of someone who has had this conversation with themselves many times. "She belonged to my mother. My mother was a school teacher and would be mortified." Elias said nothing, but something at the corner of his mouth moved in a way it had not moved in some time. He finished his breakfast and went back to the workshop. It was on the 4th day that Clara placed the piece of paper on his workbench. He had come in at midday to find it there, weighted down by the coffee cup she had brought with it, which was still warm. He picked it up and read it standing at the bench, and what he read made him set it down and pick it up again and read it a second time more carefully. It was the accounts. Not his accounts as they existed in the ledger book he kept on the shelf above the workbench, which represented his best understanding of where the money went each month. These were his accounts as they apparently actually were, compiled from the receipts and invoices she had found in the box on the shelf beside the ledger, cross-referenced against the payments recorded and the deliveries received, laid out in Clara's small, precise handwriting with a clarity that made the problem immediately visible to anyone who looked. Harlan Briggs, his leather supplier out of Cheyenne, had been under-delivering by weight for 6 weeks. Not dramatically, not enough to be obvious on any single delivery, but consistently. The kind of consistent that was not accident. 7% short on the first delivery. 6.5 on the second. 8 on the third. Across 6 weeks, it amounted to enough leather to make 2 complete saddles, which at current prices represented more than a week's revenue, simply gone. At the bottom of the page, Clara had written, "I may have overstepped. I found the receipts while looking for paper. If you would prefer I had not, please say so." Elias looked at the paper for a long time. Then he went to the kitchen. Clara was at the table with a mending basket, repairing what appeared to be a tear in one of her own dresses, with the focused attention of someone who has learned to make things last because replacing them was not always an option. She looked up when he came in. "You found this in 1 week," he said, and held up the paper. "The pattern was visible once the numbers were in the same place," she said carefully. "I did not mean to intrude on your business." How did you know what to look for? I kept accounts for the last family I worked for, she said. In Boston. Their household staff was stealing from the pantry inventory. Small amounts, over a long time. The method is the same. She paused. People who take small amounts over long periods are counting on the fact that no single instance will be large enough to notice. They are usually right, unless someone puts all the instances in one place. Elias set the paper down on the table between them. I will write to Briggs, he said. You may want to write to 2 or 3 other suppliers as well, Clara said, returning to her mending. Check the delivery records for the same pattern. It is worth knowing whether this is particular to Briggs or whether it has become a habit with others. Elias looked at her. She was focused on her needle and did not look up. He went back to the workshop. By the end of the first week, Clara had work. Harriet Voss, who ran the general store on the corner of Main Street with the organized authority of someone who has been doing something for long enough that she no longer needs to think about how to do it, had taken one look at Clara and offered her 3 days a week. Not out of charity, she made this clear, because Harriet Voss did not do charity in the commercial sense, but because the store's inventory had been expanding with the new railroad survey crews coming through, and she needed someone who could count and organize and deal with customers without requiring constant supervision. Clara had said yes before Harriet finished the sentence. Mrs. Aldine Pruitt, the widow who taught at the schoolhouse on the north end of town, had been more cautious in her assessment, the way a woman in a position of community responsibility tends to be cautious about anything that might attract commentary. But she had interviewed Clara for 20 minutes about her education and her experience with children, and what she had found at the end of those 20 minutes had apparently been satisfactory, because Clara came home that Tuesday evening with an arrangement for 3 afternoons a week with the younger students. She told Elias about it over supper with the carefully contained excitement of someone who is accustomed to managing their own expectations, but has not quite managed to manage this particular one. Mrs. Pruitt seems very capable, she said, in the tone of a person who is leading up to the actual thing they want to say. She is, Elias said. The schoolhouse is well maintained. It is. The children I saw seemed engaged. A pause. She has agreed to have me work with the youngest group, reading and arithmetic, primarily. The careful containment faltered slightly, just at the edges. I have always liked teaching. I did not know how much until I was no longer doing it. Elias looked at her across the table. She was looking down at her plate, redistributing her food with her fork in the way people do when they are feeling something they are not sure they have permission to feel. It is good work, he said. She looked up. Yes, she said. It is. Something settled in the space between them at the table. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the first faint possibility of it, the way a room feels when someone finally gets the fire going after a long cold period. Not warm yet, but moving in that direction. Duchess said something unintelligible, and then, with what seemed like deliberate comedic timing, added, "Damnation." Clara pressed her lips together. Elias looked at the parrot. 40 words, he said. 40 words, Clara confirmed, her voice slightly unsteady. It was on the second Thursday that Silas Vane came into the general store while Clara was working. Elias heard about it afterward from Harriet, who had been behind the counter the entire time, and who described the interaction with the compressed precision of a woman who has been watching people long enough to know what their behavior means even when their words suggest something else entirely. Silas Vane was 45 years old and had come to Fort Laramie the previous spring with investment capital from somewhere back east and the easy confidence of a man who has found that money deployed patiently and at the right moments, tends to smooth most of the obstacles that other men have to climb over. He had already acquired 2 commercial properties in town and had made several approaches to Elias about the saddle shop, which occupied a position on the main street that Vane had identified as strategically valuable for a reason he had not yet been entirely transparent about. Elias had declined each approach with the polite brevity of someone who is not interested and does not intend to become interested. Vane had received each refusal with the gracious patience of someone who has simply decided to wait. He came into the store that Thursday morning ostensibly for lamp oil and came away with it, plus a prolonged and carefully casual conversation with Harriet that gradually migrated in the direction of the young woman working at the back of the store, organizing canned goods with the systematic focus that Harriet had already identified as one of Clara's more useful qualities. "New in town," Vane had said, in the tone of a man noting something of mild interest. "Came in on the stage last week," Harriet had said, in the tone of a woman who has decided to provide exactly as much information as she chooses to provide and no more. "Friends of yours." "She's working for me." "Is she?" And then he had looked at Clara for a moment, just looked at her with the considering attention of a man performing a quiet calculation, and then he had paid for his lamp oil and left. It was what he said on the way out that Harriet mentioned, not loudly. To the man who had come in with him, a quiet fellow who worked in Vane's office and whose name Harriet had never bothered to learn because something about him suggested that learning his name would not be a useful investment. "Find out where she came from," Vane had said, just at the door. "Someone who shows up in a town like this, in the middle of winter, with nothing but trunks and a bird. There's always a reason." Harriet relayed this to Elias that evening in the flat, and specific way she relayed things she thought he should know, without editorializing, without recommending action, simply laying the information in front of him, the way Clara had laid the accounts paper on his workbench. Elias listened. He did not say anything immediately. Then he said, "Thank you, Harriet." She went home. He stood in the shop alone for a while with his hand flat on the workbench and the lamp burning low, and thought about a man who looked at a woman with nothing to her name and thought, "There's always a reason," and how that sentence could mean 2 different things, depending on what kind of man was saying it. Noah came for supper that Friday. He had asked permission first, which was unusual enough to be notable, arriving at the workshop on Thursday afternoon with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether he is welcome and who has decided that uncertainty is not going to stop him from showing up anyway. "I would like to apologize," Noah said. "To both of you. Together. If you will allow it." Elias had looked at him for a long moment. "Friday," he said. 6 o'clock. Noah arrived at 5:55 with a loaf of bread from the bakery still warm from the oven, and the expression of a man walking toward something he deserves but is afraid of anyway. Clara was at the stove. She turned when he came in, and there was a moment between them, a brief and careful renegotiation of how they were going to relate to each other in the light of what he had done and what it had cost her, and what, against all reasonable expectation, it had also given her. It was the kind of moment that cannot be scripted or managed, only moved through, and they moved through it the way people sometimes manage to move through difficult things, imperfectly and honestly, and without making it worse than it needed to be. "Mr. Carr," she said. "Miss Wynn," said Noah. "I am sorry, genuinely. What I did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and I have been trying to construct a version of that fact that makes me look better than it does, and I cannot find one." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Not the apology. The original decision. Why?" Noah glanced at Elias, who was standing at the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man watching something he has no intention of interrupting. "Because," Noah said carefully, "the man who wrote those letters is who my brother used to be, before he lost Rose. And I thought that if he met someone real, in the actual physical world, rather than the one inside his head where it is just him and grief talking to each other, he might remember that person still existed somewhere." The kitchen was quiet. Clara turned back to the stove. "Sit down, Mr. Carr," she said. "Supper is almost ready." Something in Elias's chest moved at an angle it had not moved in a long time. He went to the table and sat down. They ate, the three of them, and it was awkward in the first half hour, the way things are awkward when too much has been said and too much is still being held back. But Noah was constitutionally incapable of sustained silence, and Clara, it turned out, had a dry and precise wit that emerged most fully when she was comfortable enough to let it. And by the end of the meal, there was something at the table that was not quite ease but was in the general direction of it. Noah told a story about a customer that morning who had fallen asleep in the barber's chair and snored so loudly that the customer in the next chair had complained about the noise. Clara offered, in return, a story about a child in her classroom that afternoon who had argued with complete sincerity that the letter Q was unnecessary and should be removed from the alphabet, and had presented his case with a rigorous logic that she found herself unable to entirely refute. Elias listened. He did not say much, but he was listening, and there is a quality to listening, to real listening, that is different from simply being present in a room, and Clara noticed it the way she had apparently noticed most things, quietly and without making a point of it. After Noah left, she cleared the table, and Elias brought the dishes to the basin, and they worked in the kitchen together in a silence that was different from the silences of the first days, easier somehow, less careful. "Your brother loves you," Clara said. She was washing a plate with the focused attention she brought to most tasks. "He interferes," Elias said. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive." She handed him the plate to dry. "After my parents died, a friend of mine used to come to my rooms every Tuesday with food I had not asked for and sit with me until I ate it. I found it intrusive at the time." She paused. "I was wrong." Elias dried the plate and set it on the shelf. "What happened to her?" he said. "The friend." "She married a man in Providence and moved away." A small pause. "We still write, when I have a stable address to write from." Something moved through her voice, briefly, and then it was gone. She would have found Duchess absolutely appalling. It was the Friday of the second week when Elias came home to find Clara attempting to hang new curtains on the window of the main room. She had dragged a chair from the kitchen to stand on, which was not quite tall enough, and was stretching upward with the curtain rod in both hands, and her face set in the concentrated expression of someone who has decided that if they simply commit to the action with sufficient force, it will probably work out. He stood in the doorway. He did not say it in time. The chair shifted. Her foot slipped. She came off the chair sideways with a sound of pure surprise, the curtain rod swinging in one hand, and Elias crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her before she reached the floor, his arms closing around her waist from behind as her weight came back against his chest. They stopped. The curtain rod swung to a halt. From the cage in the corner, Duchess made a sound that under other circumstances might have been described as commentary. Clara was very still in his arms. He could feel her breathing, could feel the moment her surprise settled into awareness, could feel the exact instant when she realized that the crisis was over and what remained was this: the two of them standing in the middle of the room in the late afternoon light with his arms still around her and neither of them having yet made the decision to step away. She turned her head. Not much. Just enough that he could see her profile, the line of her jaw, the dark hair that had once again found its way loose from wherever she had put it that morning. "Elias," she said. His name in her voice sounded different from how he had expected it to sound, in the abstract theoretical way he had occasionally, without intending to, imagined her saying it. He stepped back. He set her on her feet carefully, and released her, and took one full step away, and looked at the window, and the half-hung curtain, and the chair lying on its side on the floor, with the deliberate focus of someone who needs something to look at that is not the person in front of them. "You need a ladder," he said. His voice came out level. He was unreasonably grateful for that. "Yes," said Clara. Her voice was also level, and he suspected she was also unreasonably grateful for it. "I see that now." Duchess offered her opinion. It was not a polite opinion. 40 words, Elias said. 40 words, Clara said, and then she laughed, and he laughed, and it was the first time they had laughed at the same thing at the same moment, and the room felt different after it, the way rooms sometimes do when something that has been held in careful suspension finally shifts into a new and different configuration. He picked up the fallen chair. He did not look at her directly for the rest of the evening, and she did not look at him directly either, and they both understood perfectly well why, and neither of them said so, and the not saying so had a quality of its own that Elias lay awake thinking about long after the house had gone quiet. He did not know what Noah had started. He was beginning to be afraid that he did, and on a Saturday morning, when Silas Vane walked into the saddle shop and laid a folded piece of paper on the workbench and looked at Elias with the patient certainty of a man who believes he holds a card worth playing, Elias felt two things simultaneously: the cold understanding of what was coming, and underneath it, something new and entirely unwelcome. The specific fear of a man who has just discovered that he has something to lose again. He had not felt that in 3 years. He picked up the paper. On the second railing. He installed it on a Thursday morning before she was awake, working quietly in the cold stairwell with his tools while the house was still. The stairs had a single railing on the left side, which was adequate for most purposes, but Clara came down those stairs every morning and evening and had caught herself against the wall twice in his presence, and surely more times when he was not watching. He did not mention it. When Clara came down for breakfast and her hand found the new railing where there had been none the day before, she stopped on the second step from the bottom and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked toward the workshop where Elias had already retreated, and then she looked back at the railing, and then she continued down to the kitchen without saying anything. She did not say anything about it that day or the day after, but Elias noticed that she used it every time, with the deliberate care of someone who has been given something and intends to take proper care of it. Clem Hadley came by the workshop on a Thursday afternoon in the second week with the unhurried purpose of a man conducting routine business. "Just so you know," Clem said, settling his weight onto the stool beside the workbench, "the talk around town has settled down some." "What talk?" Elias said without looking up. "The talk about the woman staying in your house," Clem said, with the equanimity of someone who is not going to pretend this has not been a subject of local discussion. It was considerable for about a week. People wondered. You know how it is. Elias continued stitching. And now Harriet Voss has put the word out that Miss Wynn is a capable woman doing honest work, and Mrs. Pruitt has mentioned her favorably at the Ladies' Aid meeting, which carries considerable weight. Clem paused. And people have seen how she conducts herself, quietly, without fuss, without asking for special consideration. That counts for something in a town like this. Elias set down the stitching tool and looked at the sheriff. Is there a reason you are telling me this? He said. Clem looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man choosing his words. I have known you for 11 years, Elias. I knew Rose. I watched what happened to you when she died, and I watched what you did with it, which was to fold yourself up like something broken and put yourself on a shelf. He looked at Elias directly. I am telling you this because I want you to know that whatever you decide, you will not be going against the grain of this town. Miss Wynn has made herself a place here, and so has the sound of you laughing again. He stood up from the stool. That is all I came to say, he said, and went out. Elias sat for a long time with his hands flat on the workbench. He did not open the paper that night. He set it on the workbench beneath the lamp and looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he knows is going to cost him something before he has even read the first line. And then he covered it with a piece of leather and went back to work and did not touch it again until Vane had been gone for 20 minutes, and the sound of his footsteps had long since faded from the boardwalk outside. When he finally unfolded it, standing alone in the workshop with the lamp burning close, he read it through twice. Then he folded it again and put it in his coat pocket and went inside and said nothing to Clara, who was at the table with her students' copybooks spread before her, making small, careful notations in the margins with the focused patience of someone who takes seriously the work of teaching children to form their letters correctly. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his face. She looked back down at the copybooks without asking. He went to bed. He did not sleep. The cold that arrived in the second week of December was a different animal from the cold of the first. The first cold had been sharp and immediate, the kind that announces itself and demands to be dealt with. This new cold was quieter. It settled over Fort Laramie like something permanent, a gray and windless cold that turned the sky the color of old pewter and muffled sound and made the distance between buildings feel longer than it was. The kind of cold that gets inside things, inside houses, inside coats, inside the spaces between people who are being careful with each other. The stage road had reopened briefly and then closed again. Clara had not mentioned Boston. Elias had not mentioned the paper in his pocket. They continued their routines with the careful attention of two people navigating around something that has not yet been named, and the unnamed thing was present at every meal and in every doorway, and in the particular quality of the silence that settled over the house at each odd evening when the work of the day was done and there was nothing left to do but be in the same space together. It was on a Wednesday night in the third week of December that everything shifted. Elias was still in the workshop at 9 in the evening when he heard it. A sound from the house, not loud. A sound that should not have alarmed him, but there was something in the quality of it, some irregularity in the rhythm that brought him to his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He crossed the yard and came in through the back door. Clara was on the kitchen floor, not fallen. She had made it to the floor intentionally, sliding down the side of the cabinet with her back against it and her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around herself, which was a posture that meant she had known this was coming and had been trying to get somewhere safe before it arrived. Her face was flushed with a heat that was entirely wrong for the cold of the kitchen. Her breathing was shallow and too fast. When she lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. "I am fine," she said. "You are not," he said. He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her and put the back of his hand against her forehead the way he had seen the doctor do it, and what he felt there made him draw a short breath. She was burning. "How long?" he said. "I felt poorly this afternoon," she said. "I thought it would pass." "Why did you not say anything?" She looked at him with the expression of someone for whom that question has an obvious answer that she does not particularly want to give out loud. He understood it anyway. She had not said anything because she did not want to be a burden in a house where she already felt like an imposition, and the thought of adding illness to the list of things she had brought through his door without his asking was evidently more than she was willing to do. He stood up. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then come with me." He got her upstairs and into the spare room and brought every extra blanket in the house and built the fire in the small hearth in the corner of the room up to a level he would not have bothered with for himself. And he boiled water and made tea the way his mother had made it when he and Noah were sick as children, with dried willow bark steeped long enough to bring a fever down, the recipe so old and so plain that it required no thought at all, only the memory of being taken care of. Clara sat against the headboard wrapped in blankets and watched him move around the room. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. He set the tea on the bedside table and pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the bed and sat down. She looked at him across the small distance. "Elias?" "Drink the tea," he said. She drank the tea. The fever climbed through the night. Elias did not leave. He had thought he would stay an hour until she was settled and the medicine had begun its work, and then he would go back to his own room and sleep and check on her in the morning. That was the reasonable plan. The plan of a man maintaining appropriate distance and appropriate roles. He stayed the night. He refreshed the cool cloth on her forehead when the fever peaked. He kept the fire going. He watched the window for the first gray suggestion of dawn, and when it came, he was still in the chair, awake, with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on Clara's face, which in sleep had lost the careful management she brought to every waking moment and was simply her, unguarded. The face of a young woman who was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with illness. She had been exhausted from the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single hard event, but from the sustained effort of being a person alone in the world without the cushion of family or money or the particular safety that comes from belonging somewhere, and still showing up every day and doing the work and not letting it show. He sat with that understanding through the remaining hours of the night. She woke at mid-morning. The fever had broken sometime in the early hours, leaving her pale and wrung out and clear-eyed. She turned her head on the pillow and found him. Elias was asleep in the chair beside the bed, still fully dressed, his head dropped forward onto his chest, both hands open on his knees in the loose posture of someone who fell asleep without intending to. Clara lay still and looked at him for a long time. She did not wake him. By evening, she was at the table downstairs, wrapped in 2 blankets, eating the soup Elias had made from whatever he had found in the kitchen, which turned out to be a competent and unfussy broth that tasted exactly like something made by a person who has fed themselves alone for 3 years and has no interest in pretending that cooking is anything other than fuel. She told him this. He looked at her across the table. "You are feeling better," he said. "I am." She wrapped her hands around the bowl. "You stayed all night." "You had a high fever." "You stayed all night," she said again. not as a repetition, but as a different sentence, the kind that is really a question. He looked at the table. Yes. The fire in the main room snapped. Duchess, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, said something soft and indistinct from her cage. "Elias," Clara said. He looked up. "Rose died in childbirth," she said. Not a question. She had known this for weeks. "And the baby only lived a few hours." "Yes," he said. "You were there." "Yes." She did not ask him to elaborate. She did not fill the silence with the helpful approximations people sometimes offer when someone else's grief makes them uncomfortable. She simply held what he had said in the space between them with a steadiness that Elias recognized as the steadiness of someone who knows something about sitting with things that cannot be fixed. "I was 25, he said. He had not said this out loud, in this form, to anyone. We had been married 14 months. I had just finished the last room in the house. He stopped. I thought I had time. I thought there would be more time. The fire. The lamp. The dark December evening pressing at the windows. When my parents died, Clara said, I was 19. They went within 6 months of each other. My father first, then my mother. And after my mother, I thought the feeling would pass eventually. She looked at the soup bowl. Oop. It does not pass. It changes shape, but it does not pass. No, Elias said. It does not. She sounds like she was remarkable, Clara said, from the things Noah has said. She was quiet, Elias said. People sometimes thought that meant she was shy. She was not shy. She just understood that most conversations did not need her to be loud in them. He paused. She would have found a great deal to say to you, I think. Clara looked at him. He had not intended to say that. It had arrived without his permission, the way the laugh had arrived on the morning Clara fell from the water trough. I think I would have liked that, Clara said carefully. He taught her to ride the following week. He had not offered. She had asked with the direct practicality she brought to most things, pointing out that in a town like Fort Laramie, the ability to ride was not a luxury, but a functional necessity. He had a mare named Clover, a steady gray animal of middle age with a long history of tolerating beginners, who regarded Clara's arrival in the stable with the philosophical equanimity of something that has seen most things and found them manageable. She will not throw you, Elias said. How do you know? Clara said. Because I know her. She is not theatrical. She will stand still and wait for you to figure it out. That is a very specific reassurance. It is the honest one. He showed her the basics on the first day and let her practice them without rushing. She was careful, which was better than bold in the early stages of learning, and she listened to instruction with her full attention and without the defensive anxiety of someone who is afraid of being wrong. On the third day, she held the canter for the length of the paddock without slipping. She brought Clover around to the fence where Elias was standing and looked at him from the saddle with the expression of someone who has just managed something they were not certain they could manage. A pure and unguarded delight that arrived on her face before she could organize it into something more composed. He was smiling. Not the careful, almost smile of a man who has decided that slight amusement is the maximum appropriate response. A real smile, present and full, the kind that changes a face rather than merely visiting it. Clara looked at him. She had seen him laugh on the morning she arrived. She had seen the near smiles, and the controlled expressions and the moments where his face moved towards something warmer before he collected it back. She had not seen this. "There," she said quietly. He realized what she was looking at and looked away, at the fence post, at the distant gray line of the mountains. "Again," he said, "from the far end." She turned Clover around. He stood at the fence with his hand on the top rail and watched her ride and did not examine whatever was happening in his chest with any more care than was absolutely necessary. Noah came by the workshop the following Saturday. He spent 20 minutes talking about customers and weather and road conditions, and then he ran out of neutral subjects and arrived, inevitably, at the one he had come to discuss. "She is good for you," he said. Elias continued stitching. "I have not said that to start an argument. I have said it because it is observable. You come in for meals. You are sleeping. You laughed at something Clem said at the post office yesterday, which Clem told me about in a tone that suggested he was going to write it in his journal." He paused. "You are present in your own life again, Elias. In a way you have not been in 3 years. She is staying in the spare room," Elias said. "She works for Harriet and teaches at the school. It is a practical arrangement. It is more than that. Noah, I am not telling you anything you do not already know. I am only pointing out that knowing something and being willing to act on it are two different things, and the distance between them is where I have watched you live for 3 years." Elias set down the stitching tool. "What if I lose her?" he said. The workshop was very quiet. "What if I open that door again and it goes the same way? What if I let myself care and something happens?" Noah was quiet for a moment. "Then you will grieve," he said, "and it will be terrible. And I will be there, the way I was there before, and you will survive it the way you survived before, because that is what you do." He paused. "But Elias, the question is not whether you might lose her. The question is whether what you are doing now can still be called living." Elias looked at the photograph on the shelf. Rose, smiling the way she always smiled, like the sun coming out. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the stitching tool and went back to work. And Noah, who knew when he had said the thing that needed saying, collected his coat from the peg and let himself out. It was on a Tuesday evening that Silas Vane came back. Not to the workshop this time, to the house. He came at the dinner hour, which Elias noted, because men who come to your house at the dinner hour have usually calculated the intimacy of the timing. "Carr," Vane said pleasantly, "I hope I am not interrupting." "You are," Elias said. Vane smiled in the way of a man who finds directness mildly amusing. "I will be brief then. I wanted to circle back to our conversation about the shop." He glanced past Elias to Clara. "Miss Wynn, I have heard good things about your work at Harriet's store." Clara looked at him with the quiet and level attention she brought to things she was not yet sure how to classify. "Thank you," she said. Vane looked back at Elias. "The offer stands, Carr. Better than the last one in light of the recent setback with the Cheyenne contract." He let that land. "Think about it. A fresh start, perhaps, under different circumstances." Another glance at Clara. "For everyone." He left before Elias could formulate a response that was both accurate and appropriate. Elias closed the door. "He knows about the Cheyenne contract," Clara said from the table. "Yes," Elias said. "He should not know about that. I filed that correspondence myself. It was not public. She was looking at him steadily across the table, and in her expression he saw what she had put together, the same thing he had put together, the understanding that information does not move on its own, that someone had moved it, and that the shape of what had been happening over the past weeks was not a series of unconnected inconveniences, but something with a logic to it. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. That night, Elias went to the shelf above the workbench and took down the photograph. He had not held it in months. The frame was cool in his hands, the wood smooth from years of being touched and then not touched, and Rose's face looked up at him from the blurred image with the same smile it always had. He sat down on the stool. He did not speak out loud. But in the interior space where the most honest conversations happen, he spoke to Rose with the plainness that she had always deserved from him. He told her about Clara, not the facts of the arrangement, the real thing. The way the house felt different now when he came in from the workshop, the way his feet moved faster on the path from the workshop to the back door than they had moved anywhere in 3 years. The way something in him had been waking up, slowly and without his permission, like feeling coming back into a limb that has been numb for a long time. He told Rose he was afraid. He told her he did not know how to do this without feeling like a man who had abandoned the most important thing that ever happened to him, and that on his better days, he was beginning to think Noah might be right. He told her he was sorry. Not for what he was feeling. He had been sorry for long enough. He was sorry for the time they had lost, for the years that had not happened, for the mornings she had not seen from the east-facing window she had wanted in the spare room of the house he built for her. He sat in the workshop for a long time with the photograph in his hands. When he finally set it back on the shelf, he set it carefully, the way you set something down when you are not putting it away, only putting it in its right place, which is different. Then he went inside. The next morning he was in the workshop before first light, as always. But when the light from the kitchen window came on across the yard, warm and yellow against the December dark, he found himself looking at it in a way he had not looked at it before. Not with the calculated indifference of a man who has trained himself not to notice the ordinary evidences of warmth. With something else, something that felt, cautiously and against his better judgment, like anticipation. The kitchen light. Clara at the stove. The oatmeal made properly, with salt. He looked at the light for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he set down his tools and crossed the yard and went inside. He came in from the workshop at midday to find the note. Not Clara's handwriting. A folded paper slipped under the workshop door, the handwriting precise and businesslike, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a man who has had it trained out of personality and into function. He unfolded it, read it once, set it down on the workbench, picked it up, and read it again. It was a copy of a letter, dated from Boston 3 months earlier, written on the letterhead of a household he did not recognize, signed by a woman he did not know, describing a version of Clara Wynn that had no resemblance to any Clara Wynn Elias had encountered in 3 weeks of living in the same house as her. At the bottom, in different handwriting, a single line. I thought you should know who you have brought into your home, Carr, before it costs you more than the Cheyenne contract. No signature. He did not need one. Elias set the paper down on the workbench with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling what his hands do when his mind is not yet certain what to do with them. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. He looked at the workshop door. He looked at the paper. Then he picked it up and went inside. It was the first time she had spoken the Alderton name to him since the night she arrived. They were at the kitchen table after the evening meal, the dishes already cleared, and Clara was reviewing her students' copybooks while Elias repaired a small piece of harness that had been sitting on the corner of the workbench waiting for his attention for 2 weeks. Outside, the wind had picked up again, working at the house with the persistence of the Wyoming winter. "I want to ask you something," Clara said, not looking up from the copybook. "You do not have to answer if you would rather not." "Ask," Elias said. "The family in Boston. The Aldertons." She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. "Did you believe me when I told you what happened?" He set down the harness. "Yes," he said. "Before you finished telling me." She looked at him for a moment. "How?" she said. "You had no reason to believe me over a written letter." "The accounts," he said. She waited. "The way you handled the accounts when you found the error with Briggs. You did not come to me with an accusation. You came to me with documentation laid out so clearly that I could see the problem myself without being told what to think about it." He picked up the harness again. "A woman who fabricates a story about a man who tried to harm her does not also happen to be the kind of woman who presents evidence without editorializing. Those are the same quality. Honesty without performance. I have never seen them in different people." Clara looked at her copybook. "That is a very specific observation," she said. "I have had time to think about it," he said. She did not say anything else about it, but when she went up to bed that night, she paused in the kitchen doorway and said simply, "Thank you, Elias." Not for believing her. He understood that she was thanking him for something more precise than that, for the way he had said it, without sentiment, as a matter of straightforward assessment, which was exactly what it had been. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went upstairs. He sat in the kitchen for a while with the harness and the lamp and the sound of the wind, and felt the particular quality of a house that has someone in it. There was also the matter of the horse. 2 days after the riding lesson where Clara held the canter, a man came into the shop to sell a young mare he could no longer afford to keep through the winter. She was a sorrel, maybe 6 years old, with a calm eye and good conformation and a disposition that reminded Elias, in some inexplicable way, of Clara herself. Practical, unhurried, sensible, not given to drama. He bought her. He told himself it was a business decision. A second horse was useful. The mare was priced below her value. These were facts. He named her Patience, which was not a name he had planned, but which arrived when he was leading her into the stable, and she turned her head and regarded him with the same level attention Clara brought to things she was figuring out. He did not mention the horse to Clara for 4 days. When she finally saw Patience in the stable on a Saturday morning, she stood at the stall door for a long moment. She looked at the horse, and she looked at Elias, and she looked at the horse again. "She is yours," Elias said, "if you want her." Clara turned to look at him fully. "You bought me a horse," she said. "I bought a horse," he said. "She happens to be suitable for someone learning to ride. The arrangement is practical." Clara looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has decided not to argue with a practical man about practical arrangements. Then she turned back to Patience, reached up, and let the mare sniff her hand. "Hello," Clara said quietly. "I am told this arrangement is practical." Patience blew softly against her palm. Elias went back to the workshop. Clara was at the kitchen table when he came in. She had the younger students' copybooks spread before her, making her small, careful notations in the margins with the focused patience of someone who takes seriously the work of teaching children to form their letters correctly. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle of light across the work and across her face and across the kitchen that Elias had spent 3 years keeping as cold and functional as possible because warmth in an empty house is its own kind of cruelty. He set the paper on the table in front of her. He did not say anything. He stood back and let her read it. He had told himself, crossing the yard from the workshop with the letter in his hand, that he was going to be fair, that he was going to set it before her and let her speak before he decided anything, because whatever else he had become in 3 years of grief and isolation, he was not a man who condemned without hearing. Clara Wynn had given him no reason to be anything other than fair. She read it through once quickly, the way a person reads something they have been fearing might exist. Then she read it again more slowly. Her face did nothing dramatic. No color change, no visible distress. Just the careful stillness of someone who has had a long time to practice not letting what they feel show in places where it might be used against them. She set it down. She looked at it on the table for a moment. Then she looked up at him. Her eyes were steady. Her hands rested flat on either side of the copybooks, not gripping anything. Simply resting. The way hands rest when the person they belong to has decided that stillness is the only thing they can guarantee right now. "You want to know if it is true," she said. "I want to hear what you have to say about it," Elias said. "The household in that letter is the Alderton family," she said. "I worked for them for 2 years. Mr. Alderton began making approaches to me in the spring of my 2nd year. I refused them. I was consistent, and I was clear." She looked at the letter on the table. He did not accept that answer. His wife found him in a hallway one evening attempting to prevent me from leaving a conversation I had already tried to end 3 times. She chose to believe his account rather than mine. I was dismissed that evening without a reference. She wrote that letter to every domestic employment agency in Boston within a week. The kitchen was very quiet. "That is what happened," Clara said. "I have no documents. I have no witnesses. I have nothing except the account I have just given you, which I understand is not the same as evidence." She looked at him directly. "You may believe it or not. That is your right, but I will not argue for it. I am done arguing for my own character to people who have already decided what they believe." She looked back down at the copybooks. She picked up her pencil. Elias stood at the far side of the table and looked at her bent head and felt something he had not felt in 3 years. A sharp and clarifying anger, not at Clara, at the particular and ancient injustice of a world that takes a woman's word and weighs it against a man's and finds it lighter without examining either one. He said nothing. He turned and walked out of the kitchen and out of the house and into the December night without his coat. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. She heard his footsteps cross the yard and then continue past the workshop, which was unusual. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the lamp flame and thought about all the careful, patient work of the past 3 weeks. The oatmeal every morning. The accounts on the workbench. The writing lessons. The evenings where conversation had slowly opened into something warmer than either of them had planned for. She thought about waking from a fever to find him asleep in the chair beside her with his hands open on his knees. She thought about the smile on his face when she held the canter for the first time, the real one. She stood up. She went to the workshop first. On the bench, She found the note Silas Vane had slipped under the door. She found a loose page and a pencil and copied 3 lines of Vane's handwriting carefully, matching the pen pressure and the particular slant of his capital letters. She had recognized the hand from the store receipts at Harriet's weeks ago and had said nothing, waiting to see if she was right about what it meant. She folded the copy and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went upstairs to the spare room and packed her bag. She went to Clem Hadley's house first. The sheriff answered the door in his shirt sleeves with the alert expression of a man who has been a lawman long enough that a knock at this hour does not surprise him. He looked at Clara on his doorstep, noted the bag over her shoulder, and stepped back to let her in without asking her to explain herself on the porch. She sat at his kitchen table and laid out everything she had put together: the timing of Vane's approaches to Elias, the movement of the Cheyenne correspondence, the note slipped under the workshop door. She put the handwriting copy beside the store receipts she had carried in her pocket for 2 weeks. Clem looked at the papers for a long time. "You did this before you packed your bag," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because it was the right thing to do," she said. "Whatever happened between Elias and me tonight, someone was trying to take his livelihood, and I had information that could stop it." Clem nodded slowly, in the way of a man who has been doing his job long enough to recognize the difference between the person who does the right thing because it is convenient and the person who does it because they cannot do otherwise. "Go on then," he said. "I will handle the rest." She collected her bag and went out into the December dark. She saw the smoke from half a block away, not the ordinary smoke of chimneys, sharper, with something underneath it that did not belong to ordinary burning. She ran. The workshop door was unlocked. The fire was in the corner near the floor joists, small still but purposeful, the kind that has been encouraged rather than the kind that starts by accident. Clara dropped her bag in the yard, took the saddle blanket from the peg inside the door, and began beating at the base of the fire, driving it back from the joists, keeping it from the wall. The smoke was thick and low, and she kept her face turned away and breathed through her sleeve and kept hitting. She was on her 3rd pass when Elias came through the door. She handed him the blanket without speaking and went to the water barrel. 2 trips with the bucket, 3, soaking the burned section of floor until the smoke turned white and then thin and then stopped. They stood in the ruined corner of the workshop in the dark, both breathing hard. Elias looked at the damage. The floor joists were badly burned, repairable, but not quickly. He looked at the file cabinet. The lock had been forced, not subtly. The folder containing the Cheyenne contract was gone. He stood with his hands at his sides and understood the full shape of what had happened. "I went to Clem before I came here," Clara said behind him. He turned. She stood in the doorway with the empty bucket in one hand, her face streaked with soot, her breath coming in white clouds. Not frightened, not apologetic, simply present. "I told him everything I had put together about Vane. I gave him the handwriting copy." She met his eyes. "Whatever happened between you and me tonight was separate from that. His livelihood needed protecting. That had nothing to do with whether you believed me." He looked at her for a long moment. "You went to Clem before you packed your bag," he said. "Yes." "Clara." "You do not need to say anything," she said quickly. "I understand where things stand. I will collect Duchess and be out of your way before morning." "Clara." She stopped. He looked at her across the ruined floor. This woman who had come here with $7 and a cursing parrot. who had placed a flower beside Rose's photograph without being asked and without mentioning it afterward, who had saved his workshop and gone to the sheriff before she packed her bag in that order, because that was simply how she was arranged inside. "I went to Rose's grave tonight," he said. She went very still. "I told her about you. Not the practical facts of the arrangement, the actual thing." He held her gaze. "What I said to her is something I will tell you properly, not in a burned workshop at midnight." The corner of his mouth moved. "But I will not have you leave this house tonight believing that my silence in the kitchen meant what you thought it meant." The December cold moved through the open door between them. "What did it mean?" Clara said. "It meant I was ashamed," he said. "Not of you. Of the fact that I stood there and let you account for yourself like a person on trial when you have done nothing in this house, not one single thing in 3 weeks, that was not honest and decent, and more than I had any right to expect from someone I had treated as an inconvenience from the first moment she arrived." Something moved in her expression. Not tears. Something softer than the steadiness. Something that had been held behind it for some time and was now, in this burned and smoky corner of a Wyoming workshop, choosing to surface. "You caught me," she said quietly. "The water trough. You did not catch me that time, but every time since." A pause. "I noticed." From down the street came the sound of Clem Hadley's boots on frozen ground, and behind them 2 deputies, justice arriving as it sometimes does, slightly after the fact, but arriving nonetheless. Elias looked at the door, then back at Clara. "Go inside," he said. "Get warm. I will deal with Clem." She looked at him. "When this is done," he said, "we are going to talk. Properly, not in a burned workshop." A brief pause. "Though you should know that soot does not improve your dignity as much as you might hope." Something broke open in her expression, the warm and exhausted cousin of a laugh. 40 words, she said. "Go inside," he said. She went. Silas Vane was located in his rooms above the land office, still dressed. The forced cabinet, the burned floor joists, Clara's testimony, and the handwriting sample constituted a body of evidence that Clem described the following morning as more organized than most things he received from trained lawyers. The missing folder was recovered from Vane's room. His associate made the practical calculation that loyalty has its limits and provided a statement that covered the remainder. Elias stood in the cold through all of it, answering questions, signing papers. He thought about Clara going to Clem's door before she packed her bag, and the thought went with him through the paperwork and the cold walk home, steady and clarifying, the way true things tend to be once you have stopped finding reasons to look away from them. He pushed open the back door of the house and came into the warm kitchen. The note she had left was still on the table under the lamp. The lamp had been turned back up. Clara stood at the stove with her back to him, the soot cleaned from her face, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She turned when she heard him. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Vane has been arrested," he said. "The folder was in his room. The Cheyenne contract should be recoverable." She let out a breath. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door, the peg that had always held only one coat, and stood for a moment with his hand still on it. "Clara," he turned from the door, "I am sorry. For the kitchen. For the silence. For standing there and making you account for yourself when you had nothing to account for. You have not given me a single reason to doubt you, not one. And I let that letter make me silent when I should have spoken." She set down the teacup she was holding. "Sit down, Elias," she said. He sat. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him, and they drank their tea in the warm kitchen in the last days of December, and outside the window the Wyoming stars were out in their impossible numbers, and neither of them looked at the note still waiting under the lamp, because neither of them needed to anymore. He told her the next evening, not at the kitchen table. He came in from the workshop at the end of the afternoon and found her in the main room with a book open in her lap and Duchess drowsing on her perch in the winter light, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the scene with the particular quality of attention a man brings to something he has been thinking about all day and has finally decided to stop thinking about and simply do. "Clara," he said, "will you walk with me?" She looked up from the book. She read his face with the quiet accuracy she brought to most things, and whatever she found there made her close the book without marking her page and reach for her coat. They walked through Fort Laramie in the thin January light, past the storefronts and the livery and the schoolhouse where she spent her afternoons. And Elias did not speak until they reached the far end of the main street, where the buildings gave way to open ground, and the mountains stood at the horizon in their permanent and indifferent beauty. He stopped. He looked at the mountains for a moment. Then he turned to her. "I went to Rose's grave the night of the fire," he said. "I told you I would tell you what I said to her, and I am going to tell you now." He looked at her steadily. "I told her that I love you. Not as something that was happening to me without my consent, though that is how it started. As something I have chosen, because somewhere in the past 3 weeks, I stopped being a man who was simply enduring his life and started being a man who wanted something from it again, and that change has your name on it." The January wind moved between them. Clara looked at him with the green eyes he had first noticed on the morning she fell from the water trough, the unusual green of new grass in spring, and in them he saw the careful woman who had arrived here with $7 and a cursing parrot and had spent 3 weeks being the most quietly capable person he had ever shared a house with. "I told her I was afraid," he continued, "that I did not know how to do this without feeling like a man who had abandoned the most important thing that ever happened to him. And then I stood at her grave in the cold and understood something that Noah has been trying to tell me for 3 years, and that I was not ready to hear until that particular night." "What did you understand?" Clara said. "That loving you is not a replacement for what I had," he said. "It is not a forgetting, or a covering over, or a diminishment of anything. Rose was my first great love, and she will always have been that, and nothing changes it." He paused. "But a heart is not a fixed space with a limited capacity. It turns out to be considerably larger than I gave it credit for." He looked at her. "You fit in it, Clara. You have been fitting in it for weeks, and I kept pretending not to notice." Something moved in Clara's expression, the softness behind the steadiness, surfacing now fully and without apology in the January light. "Elias," she said, "I know you did not come here for this," he said. "I know you came here for a practical arrangement with a man who had written thoughtful letters and wanted a partner, and what you found instead was a broken workshop and a grieving man who laughed at you once, and then spent 3 weeks being as difficult as possible." The corner of his mouth moved. "I am aware that my recommendation is not strong." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You caught me every time I fell." "That is a low bar," he said. "You stayed in the chair all night when I had a fever," she said. "You built the fire up before you came to check on me. You taught me to ride with more patience than I had any right to expect." She looked at the mountains behind him. You placed a second railing on the stairs after the third time I slipped, and you did it without saying a word about it, and I did not thank you for it, and I have been meaning to. She looked back at him. You are not broken, Elias. You are the most carefully kind man I have ever met, and you have been doing your kindness so quietly that I think even you have not always noticed you were doing it. The wind moved her dark hair across her face. She looked at him with the directness that had characterized everything she had ever said to him, from the frozen main street on the morning she arrived to the burned workshop 2 nights ago. I love you too, she said. I did not plan it. I did not want to plan it because planning it felt presumptuous given the circumstances. But there it is. Elias Carr stood in the January cold at the edge of Fort Laramie, Wyoming territory, and felt something complete itself in his chest that had been incomplete for 3 long years. He reached out and tucked the strand of hair back from her face with one hand, his callous thumb brushing her cheek, and she turned her face slightly into his palm, the way a person turns toward warmth when they have been cold for a long time. He kissed her in the winter light, with the mountains at his back, and the town of Fort Laramie arranged behind them in its ordinary December business, and it was gentle and unhurried, and tasted like cold air and something he had not tasted in 3 years, which was the future. He proposed in June. The wild roses were blooming on the hillsides above town, yellow and white against the summer green, and Elias had arranged for Noah to keep watch over Duchess for the afternoon, which Noah agreed to with the unconcealed delight of a man who has been waiting for this moment for considerably longer than the people most directly involved. He took Clara out to the cottonwood grove above the valley on 2 horses, Clover for Clara and his own gray gelding, and they spread a blanket in the shade and ate cold chicken and fresh bread and watched a hawk work the thermals above the far ridge in wide, patient circles. He had been carrying the ring for 2 weeks. He had commissioned it from the jeweler in Cheyenne in February, when the Cheyenne contract had been recovered and signed and the workshop floor had been rebuilt, and something in his life had settled into a shape he recognized as the shape of a future rather than simply the shape of continuing. A plain gold band with a small carved detail on the inner face, a single wildflower, because that was what she had placed beside Rose's photograph on the morning after the night she found the drawer, and he had never forgotten it, and he did not intend to. He took it from his coat pocket and set it on the rock beside the blanket. He set beside it a small dried wildflower, the same variety picked that morning from the hillside above the cemetery where he had walked at dawn to tell Rose about today. Clara looked at the 2 things on the rock. She looked at him. I am not asking you to forget where you came from or what it cost you to get here, Elias said. I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are, which is the most capable and honest and thoroughly clumsy person I have ever known. The corner of his mouth moved. I am asking you to let me build something with you, not over the past. On top of it, the way you build anything that is meant to last, on the foundation of what came before. He picked up the ring. Will you marry me, Clara Wynn? Clara looked at him. She reached for the ring. She reached for it and caught her skirt on the edge of the rock and pitched forward directly into Elias, both of them going sideways off the blanket into the summer grass in a tangle of limbs and laughter. And he caught her the way he always caught her, and they lay in the grass looking up at the cottonwood leaves against the blue Wyoming sky, and he was laughing, really laughing. The full and genuine sound of a man who has found his way back to himself, and she was laughing too, and the ring was still in his hand. Yes, she said from somewhere in the vicinity of his shoulder, Obviously, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger in the grass under the cottonwood tree, and it fit perfectly, because he had measured it from a glove he had borrowed from her coat pocket one morning in February while she was at the school, which she did not know until he told her later that evening, at which point she pointed out that stealing a woman's glove was an unusual approach to romance. He agreed that it was. They were married in July, the Fort Laramie Chapel, on a warm Saturday morning with the windows open and the smell of summer grass coming through on the light breeze. Noah stood beside Elias with the expression of a man who has staked a considerable personal and ethical investment in this outcome and is deeply gratified to see it pay. Harriet Voss sat in the second row with a handkerchief she used with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who cries at weddings without embarrassment, says Aldine Pruitt, who had initially regarded Clara with the caution her position required, sat beside Harriet with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from its starting point. Clara walked down the aisle, in a dress the color of new cream, with wildflowers from the hillside pinned in her dark hair, and Elias stood at the front of the chapel and watched her come toward him and felt something so straightforward and uncomplicated that it took him a moment to identify it. He was happy. Not the muted, managed version of happiness that careful people allow themselves when they have been hurt badly enough. Simply happy, the way a person is happy when they are standing in the right place at the right time with the right person walking toward them. Duchess, in her cage at the back of the chapel in the care of the sheriff's deputy who had drawn the short straw, maintained a dignified silence through the entire ceremony. She waited until the moment Elias and Clara were pronounced married. Then she offered her assessment at full volume. The chapel laughed. The deputy turned red. Clara pressed her forehead against Elias's shoulder and shook with laughter, and he put his arm around her and held her there for a moment before they turned to face their life together. Their son was born in October of 1880. Elias spent the labor in the hallway outside the bedroom with Noah sitting beside him, Noah talking steadily about nothing consequential, the way he had learned to talk during the long vigils of their childhood when one of them was sick and the other needed the sound of a voice to hold on to. Elias sat with his forearms on his knees and listened and was grateful for his brother in a way he would tell him properly later when he was capable of forming sentences again. The cry came at dawn, strong and immediate and completely certain of itself. The cry of something that had arrived and intended to stay. The midwife opened the door with a smile that answered every question before he could ask it. Clara was propped against the pillows, looking exhausted and radiant in the particular way of women who have just done something enormous and know it. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in the blanket Elias had seen her knitting in the evenings for the past 3 months. And from within the bundle came small sounds of opinion. He crossed the room on legs that were not entirely steady. He looked down at his son, dark hair standing up from his head in every direction, eyes that would settle to green in the coming weeks, the same green as his mother's. A face so new and so complete that looking at it felt like looking at something that had always existed and had simply been waiting to arrive. "Can I hold him?" Elias said. His voice came out rough and low, and Clara looked at him with everything she knew about him in her eyes, and carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him without words how to hold what is most precious, which he already knew but needed to be shown again. He held his son in the October dawn and wept without any attempt to prevent it, and Clara reached up and took his hand and held it, and Noah stood in the doorway with his own eyes full and the discretion not to say anything at all. "Henry," Elias said. "Henry Rose Carr." Clara's fingers tightened around his hand. "Perfect," she said. Years passed the way years do when they are full. A daughter came in the spring of 1882, and they named her Rosalie, and Elias stood at the window of the spare room, the east-facing window, with Rosalie in his arms, watching the morning light come through the glass, and said Rose's name out loud in the empty room, not with grief, not any more, but with the particular gratitude of a man who understands that the love that came before did not end so much as it changed form, the way water changes form, still present, still essential, transformed into something the landscape could hold. Henry grew into his father's dark hair, and his mother's green eyes, and his mother's clumsiness, and his father's stubbornness, which Clara observed was a formidable combination and Elias could not argue with. The saddle shop expanded. Clara managed the accounts and the correspondence with the systematic efficiency that had first shown itself in the paper she laid on his workbench in the first week of December 1878. And the business she helped him build was considerably larger and more stable than the one he had been running alone. Noah remained unmarried, claiming he was too occupied with being the finest uncle in Wyoming Territory, which was a title no one disputed because no one tried harder for it. Duchess lived to a considerable age and maintained her vocabulary to the end, a fact that caused ongoing minor scandal and considerable private amusement in the Carr household. On a summer evening some years after the wedding, Elias found Clara at the window, the east-facing window in what had been the spare room and was now Rosalie's room, though Rosalie was downstairs in the garden with Henry, and the warm noise of children at the end of a summer day was coming up through the open window, along with the smell of grass and the last of the light. Clara was looking out at the evening, the way Rose had looked out at mornings, with the quiet happiness of someone who has found where they are supposed to be and has the sense to know it when they find it. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back into him the way she had leaned back for years, easily and without any of the careful management of the early days. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The water trough," she said. He laughed. The full, genuine, unguarded laugh that Fort Laramie had been startled by on a December morning in 1878, and that had long since become, in the Carr household and in the town that had watched this particular story unfold from its beginning, simply the sound of Elias Carr being alive in his own life. "You will never let that go," he said. "I made you laugh," she said, "after 3 years, by falling on a frozen water trough in front of half the town." She turned in his arms to look at him. "I intend to take credit for that for the rest of my life." He looked at her face in the summer evening light, this woman who had arrived with nothing and given him everything, who had placed a flower beside a photograph without being asked, who had gone to the sheriff before she packed her bag, who had held the canter on the first try and then looked at him with pure joy and reminded him what it felt like to wait for something good. "Take all the credit you want," he said. He kissed her in the east-facing window with the summer evening coming through the glass, and the sound of their children in the garden below, and outside the Wyoming sky was doing what the Wyoming sky does at the end of a summer day, turning colors that have no names in any language Elias knew. And it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and it was, without any qualification or reservation, exactly the life he was meant to be living. In the garden below, Henry called something to Rosalie. Rosalie answered at the top of her lungs. Duchess, from her cage on the back porch, offered her commentary. Elias Carr, who had not smiled for 3 years and had been smiling ever since, held his wife in the evening light and listened to the sound of his life and thought that Rose would have found all of it entirely satisfactory. He was quite certain she would have been right. There is a particular quality to the life of a man who has been rebuilt. Not the life he had before, which is gone and remains gone. As all lost things remain lost, even when you have made your peace with the losing. Not a replacement life, assembled from approximations of what was destroyed, but something genuinely new, grown from the same soil, shaped by the same hands, recognizable as belonging to the same man, while being unmistakably different from what came before. Elias Carr understood this in the way that people understand things that cannot be fully articulated, not as a proposition to be argued, but as something felt in the body, in the particular weight of daily life, in the ease with which he moved through his own days. He had rebuilt his workshop floor after the fire, working alongside 2 hired men and doing the finish carpentry himself, as he had done everything in this house, because doing things with his own hands was how he understood his ownership of them. The new floor was slightly better than the old one, better jointed, better sealed against the cold that crept up from the ground in December. The improvement was small. He noticed it every day. He had also, in the spring of 1879, expanded the workshop by 12 feet to the north. Clara had suggested it, looking at the backlog of orders that had accumulated since word spread about the quality of Carr saddles to the ranches and outfitters coming through Fort Laramie with the increasing traffic of the railroad era. She had said it practically, with a sketch she had made on a piece of paper at the kitchen table, showing how the expansion would work and what it would cost, and how long it would take to recover the investment at the current order volume. He had looked at the sketch for a long time. Then he had said, "You drew this to scale." "I measured the workshop while you were out," she said. I hope that was not intrusive. He had looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman with her precise handwriting and her careful measurements, and her habit of solving problems before they were asked to be solved, and he had felt something so straightforward it almost made him laugh. "It was not intrusive," he said. "Build it." They built it together that spring. Elias and 2 hired men and Clara, who learned quickly which end of a hammer to hold and who kept meticulous records of every board and nail, and was the person who caught the fact that the lumber yard had charged them twice for the second delivery. Fort Laramie watched the Carr workshop expand and noted it the way small towns note the evidence of prosperity in one of their own, with the particular satisfaction of people who were there at the beginning and remember what it looked like before. The beginning, in this case, being a December morning when a woman in an inadequate coat fell off a frozen water trough and a man who had not smiled in 3 years forgot for a moment that he was not supposed to. Noah told the story for years. He told it at the barber shop and at the Grange Hall and at every dinner to which he was invited, which was many, because Noah Carr was the kind of man who received many invitations. He told it with embellishments that grew more elaborate over time, and Elias corrected the embellishments every time, and Noah ignored the corrections every time. And this had become its own kind of ritual between them. The comfortable argument of 2 brothers who have navigated the full range of what that relationship can contain and have arrived, finally, at the version of each other they were always going to be. Henry heard the story so many times he could recite it. Rosalie found it romantic in the way that children find their parents romantic, with a mixture of genuine feeling and mild embarrassment. Thomas, when he was old enough to understand it, said that the whole thing sounded like something out of a dime novel, and Clara said that was because dime novels occasionally got things right, and Elias said nothing but smiled in the way he smiled now, which was often and without apology. The water trough was still there, at the edge of the boardwalk in front of the general store, still freezing solid each December, still waiting for the unwary. Clara walked past it every working day on her way to Harriet Voss's store, and every December when the first hard freeze came and it glazed over. She looked at it the way a person looks at a place where something important happened, with the full attention of someone who understands that significance is not always visible in the thing itself, but in what it set in motion. What it had set in motion, in the end, was a life. 2 lives, properly speaking. 2 people who had each, in their own way and through their own losses, arrived at the edge of something they were not sure they could survive, and who had found each other there, in the cold, in the most undignified and unlikely of circumstances, and had decided, with the particular courage of people who have already lost things they loved, to try again. Fort Laramie remembered the morning. It always would.